Okay, so this last study is about the depoliticization of spaces and what the study on political geography in Lebanon teaches us about workplace design and conflict. So one thing I'm noticing is that a lot of times in these studies, they take regions that are experiencing high levels of conflict to kind of infer conflict styles in the workplace. So I'm interested to see about this one. The first questions are, what are the practices and imaginations of space among young people in post-war Beirut? How do young people experience and reflect on spatial fragmentation in their everyday environment? How powerfully do wartime memories remain embedded within their urban framework? And finally, to what extent do their contemporary spatial skills and experiences evoke the dynamics of conflict transformation? The methods were that they conducted interviews from collaborative maps meant to investigate the materiality and imagination of space among Lebanese students from the American University of Beirut. And these students were asked to look at maps of various places, their campus, the city, and Lebanon as a whole, and essentially mark off places that had a special meaning or significance in their life. And then from this point on, they essentially discussed the meaning of these selections, basically delving into their routines and their practices. So what were they doing there? For example, if it's the cafeteria at school, why did you list that place? What are you doing there? What kind of rituals evoke significance to you? And then also the imagination and memory embedded in these frameworks. So do you have any memories at a place that you like to hang out? Because you have really strong memories of orientation, for example. So that's kind of how they delved into this practice. And then finally, the results are basically, I think we can all kind of gather that space incorporates many aspects of people's lives, from intimate introspective thoughts to political designs. Places and spaces hold a lot of significance to everyone, I think, particularly in regions that have high politicization. So this is not surprising to me. And the ways of practicing and imagining Beirut were not exclusively connected with wartime geographies, which is in contrast with the dominant image of tension between intergroup boundaries and post-war Lebanon. So this found that war, essentially, and conflict did not necessarily dictate how significant a space was to somebody else. And then the key takeaway from this, training young talent and workplace design in neutral spaces. It is useful to invest in newer employee growth and training. This can bring a new perspective to problems that may be happening between two conflicting or opposing groups, which I think we can all kind of understand. When you have someone new coming into a conflict, sometimes they can see something from a more objective perspective. And then when it comes to workplace design in neutral spaces, this study demonstrates how certain spaces are more comfortable and easier to navigate than others with their ability to neutralize conflict and rekindle bonds. In a company environment, it's important to create more neutral and common spaces for employees that are free from their company role identities and hierarchies. So essentially creating spaces that are not focused or do not emphasize different hierarchies, tasks, roles, creating spaces that are kind of eliminating those allows for an easier work environment, an easier way to handle conflict, because you don't have a space that is reminding somebody of that conflict. And so it's a little bit easier to kind of separate the space from the issue. And I think that helps everything to kind of work more smoothly. So yeah, I'll open it up to y'all's thoughts and questions.
Interesting methodology. Pretty cool the way that they did that. You know, looking at space and how people imagine space and remember space. One thing that dawned on me is one of the things that we do sometimes in training is we talk about when there's like a conflict or even just a difficult conversation to have with someone. Sometimes a good practice is to go off site, go get a coffee, do something that's different so that you get out of the normal environment where the hierarchy exists, especially if there's a power dynamic between the two people. So this is, that's space does seem to be, an important factor.
100%. I really like this study because this is something that I've looked into and been very conscious and mindful of throughout my work, especially working with youth and refugees, and looking at space and the design of how we communicate with one another in training sessions and things like that. Where am I sitting compared to where they're sitting? Where's the interpreter sitting? Space has always been, I feel like, a common theme in my mind, and so to see it now in times of conflict and war. This is really interesting. I like this takeaway. It kind of also reminds me of symbols, right? I mean, we look at this symbolism in conflicts a lot as well, especially in like times of war. And, you know, what is this flag? What does this one image represent? And it can be so dear to some, but yet so kind of polarizing to others. And it kind of aligns with this, because like symbols in space, right, images in general, I feel are important things to be mindful of when looking at conflict.
I agree. I feel like they both carry a lot of emotional weight to them. I know for me personally, like if something traumatic or something emotionally destabilizing happens to me or around me, I tend to avoid that space. If I go back into that space, it makes me uncomfortable. It makes me physically kind of jumpy and anxious. So I definitely agree with both of your points about kind of how it's important to kind of create neutral spaces, but I think also to maybe have conversations about why spaces or symbols evoke one emotional response for one person or one group and evoke a very different response for another person or another group, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about last week with like having conversations about stuff that no one wants to talk about or with a person that you would rather avoid. So yeah, I definitely like this study.
This when I first read this made me think of like kind of like what you were all saying, but I had a conflict consulting and coaching class at Pepperdine, and my professor she owns her own conflict resolution consulting firm on the East Coast, and she had a whole like segment where we just talked about her space, and she has her own building, and it's very, very open format, like compared to, you know, when you go sometimes into mediation, like it's very like you sit on opposite sides of the table with a mediator in between, and she, instead of doing that, she has couches and has them sit on couches with her there, and it just completely transforms the entire environment of the mediation and allows them to just feel more open to discuss and talk and all of that. So yeah, I found this, I mean, just relating to that, I thought it was cool. And this is obviously like slightly different, like with what Alyssa, you were saying with the traumatic experiences. And I think that's why Anupriya pulled out the training and talent piece of this as well, is because the young people who were interviewed in this did not associate those spaces with trauma, you know? And so it was kind of a reimagining of the space, and it kind of gives hope, I think, for hope and change, that, you know, our spaces don't always have to remain war torn and seen as a place of conflict and destruction, but rather can be revitalized through new lenses.
Yeah, I like this a lot too. I hadn't thought about it in this way before or made that association, but I do see how important that would be. I just, Jeremy and Sarah, how important is it for, like, thinking through this, when a peace builder is coming in, you know, on a site to do a dialogue of some sort, how important is that to find a space that, you know, is offsite or something? I mean, is that a big factor? Have y'all seen that being a big factor with some of the people that we work with?
Yeah, you know, the first thing that actually comes to mind is we had an experience, a job, and it was down in Virginia, and we ended up actually purchasing an off-site kind of place, like in a hotel, to create a very neutral space to get everyone, because the whole team in this organization was sort of at conflict with one another. There was a lot of frustration and disconnect and hostile kind of feelings involved. And so we felt like it was, the peace builder and I talked about this, like it's just most appropriate to find a space away from that. And it was transformational because of that. And then I, like a couple other times, as Noah talked about, like with mediation, same with our peacemaking process, right? So that's obviously now we're largely on Zoom, right? We're not doing in-person things, but my role with PPS was about asking questions about the space, you know, to the hiring client, like, is there a neutral space? Do you have some type of like not employee X or employee Y's office or
Right.
even
Yeah.
your office as their boss, but is there like a conference room that we could use? And if not, you know, troubleshooting from there. I think it's very important.
Yeah.
The spatial factor is certainly something that's important, and being in a neutral setting. But then also, I think Noah or Alyssa touched on this, is like when I do dialogues, I never like to have, if possible, to have like a table between the parties. It's like we need to be like nothing between us, and
Right.
typically sitting in like a triangle or like a circle of some sort. So like there's not this like head-to-head sort of feeling of competition or something. So that all plays into it psychologically a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, just in like basic mediation trainings, you go through kind of designing your ideal sort of space for doing a mediation with just yourself, and they give you all different types of scenarios, right? I've co-mediated as a volunteer, and we were very mindful of like, you know, where myself and the co-mediator were sitting, like making sure that we were not like we were spread out, and it was like in a circle, as Jeremy said. Like there's something about a circle or a triangle and not anything in between that like that's blocking the,
Yeah.
like a table might seem like, oh, it's just a table, but it's also a symbol of an obstacle maybe, or like a blockage in between the two parties, right? So there's so many, even like things on the wall, or like a plant, or, you know, like little things like that are important to take into consideration with mediations and dialogues and all of that.
Yeah.
It definitely, and I think it's interesting. I feel like it's different too on the context of what the discussion or sometimes or negotiation or mediation is. Like I think that I just thought of this when you were talking, but when I was working with Disney earlier in the year, and we were doing labor relation negotiations with union workers, and we did meet in like we had to go separate from, like, we couldn't meet at a Disney place, we couldn't meet at a union like building. We had to go to a specific like hotel, and then we spent the entire day there doing that. And it's much more formal because I think it's like a professional, like more of a professional environment. But it is very interesting how the space really does make it affects the relationship. And I know that's already been said, but I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. Well, in this study too, was the students who are imagining the play, were they directly involved? Like, were they there during wartime? Had they experienced those spaces during wartime? Or was it something that like they were just kind of seeing if the collective memory or stories had passed down to them and they were still associating with it?
To my understanding, it's the latter.
Okay. Well, that makes more sense. I would expect though, if someone had been through a war and there were particular areas where they had experienced trauma, that there'd be some lingering feeling of trauma in those. I would think. I don't know. I mean, that's why you like see people. If you have a home and like something traumatic happens in your home, a lot of times people have trouble going back to their home. You know, because it reminds them of that kind of thing.
Right.
But yeah, neutral spaces for sure important.
And even I'm just thinking about during COVID times, right? As we're largely most offices are communicating through virtual means. So how can we do that? How can we still have those neutral, mindfully designed spaces in a virtual world?
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I don't know if this matters too much. It could be an interesting question to ask, but just having a neutral third party like us create the Zoom link and it's our room, rather than like it's your boss's room and then you got to go into the boss's room and then and then like a consultant comes into that room, but just having the consultant's room be the room where everybody meets. So it's like that consultant actually controls the room. That might be something.
Yeah, that might, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think
There's no way to do it, something, so it
Oh.
feels like a different space. Oh shoot, I'm breaking up.
I wonder, well, I makes me
All right,
wonder on,
well, that's
oh.
my cue, I guess.
I think it's
we're delayed.
it's delayed. It's very much delayed. It's okay. No, I was going to say, I wonder how, in terms of Zoom, like giving people autonomy over leaving the room and leaving the group. You know how sometimes, like in breakout rooms specifically, sometimes you can choose, and the parties themselves can choose to leave. And I wonder if that creates more of it. It'd be an interesting study, but I wonder if that creates more of a safe space, giving the autonomy to leave. And I guess you can leave generally, but leave that specific breakout room to a larger group, or I don't know. It makes me wonder.
This is also reminding me of, I listened to a podcast yesterday. I don't know if you're all familiar with the work of Priya Parker. She's a conflict resolution specialist. She wrote the book, The Art of Gathering, and she was speaking, I mean, about her book, but about, you know, the art of gathering, and like with, especially in today, with the digital, you know, increase in life and activity. She talked about how on Zoom, it's important to remember, and this aligns with what Jeremy's saying, like the host is like, who's hosting this gathering? It's not Zoom, it's that individual who sends the link, or that, you know, so that person is the host. And Noah, as you're talking about, like with breakout rooms, she was kind of talking about how the with the power, like power dynamics, and like how that is played out on Zoom. And she said that the power lies in the mute button, and how much you can, because we all know, right, especially in this field of conflict resolution, like the side conversations and the size and all of that stuff says a lot, right? Those are those like kind of non-verbal, non-direct verbal, right? And being able to mute yourself, there's so much power in that, to kind of say whatever you want to say. And she said also power in the chat room too, because you can individually chat. So not that that's a good thing. It can be misused, right? It can be like a misuse of power on the Zoom. Yeah,
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.